You are standing in a cafe in Vienna, ordering coffee in fluent German, and you realize with a quiet jolt that you almost forgot your real birthday. The name on your driver's license has been yours for 18 months now, long enough that when someone calls it across a crowded room, you turn without thinking. Your apartment blocks away contains photographs of people you've never met, arranged on shelves in a way that suggests years of casual affection. There is a chip mug in the kitchen that you bought specifically because it looks like something you would have owned for a decade. Every object, every mannerism, every half-remembered anecdote about a childhood that never happened exists for one reason: to make sure that when someone looks at you, they see nothing worth questioning. The margin for error is not measured in large mistakes, but in the smallest failures of consistency: a momentary hesitation when signing your name, a flicker of confusion when asked about your mother's maiden name, an instinctive recoil from a food you're supposed to love. What most people misunderstand about false identities is that they are not masks worn over a true face. They are entire architectures of believable human experience, constructed from foundations that must hold under the weight of years, relationships, and the unpredictable scrutiny of people who have no reason to suspect you, but every reason to remember details. A passport can be forged in hours, but the quiet credibility of a life lived requires something far more sophisticated: an understanding of how memory works, how trust accumulates, how people reveal themselves in unguarded moments. The systems designed to create these identities operate on a principle that runs counter to intuition. The goal is not to be invisible, but to be utterly ordinary, so thoroughly unremarkable that you disappear into the fabric of everyday life. The most effective cover is not one that hides you, but one that makes you forgettable in exactly the right ways while being memorable in others. The kind of person someone might describe to authorities with vague warmth but no precise details. Long before an operative walks into a new city carrying documents under a name that didn't exist 2 years earlier, the identity itself has been stress-tested against the patterns of human behavior. How do people from a particular neighborhood speak when they're tired? What schools would someone of your supposed background have attended? And what would they remember about them? Not the official facts, but the textures of experience, the smell of the cafeteria, the name of a teacher everyone hated. These details are not invented arbitrarily, but reverse-engineered from psychological research into how identity is performed and perceived. The tradecraft of building a cover is less about deception and more about behavioral architecture, constructing a version of yourself that feels internally consistent not just to observers, but to you. Because the moment you have to think before answering a simple question, you've already lost. Inconsistencies emerge not from grand revelations, but from the ordinary friction of daily life. A colleague who notices you grimace at a food you claim to enjoy, a landlord who remembers you saying something about your past that contradicts what you told someone else, a friend who senses that your laughter at a shared cultural reference sounds just slightly off. The strange truth about living inside a constructed identity for long enough is that the performance eventually stops feeling like performance. The habits you adopted as cover become your actual habits. The preferences you claimed become genuine preferences. The history you memorize becomes the history you reflexively recall when your mind wanders. There are operatives who have returned from years in the field and found themselves momentarily unable to remember which version of their childhood was real, who have had to consciously reconstruct their original identity the way they once constructed the false one. The most sophisticated danger of a perfect cover is not that it might be discovered by others, but that it might consume the person living it, that the boundary between what is real and what is necessary for survival might erode so gradually you don't notice until you're standing in that cafe, stirring sugar into coffee, and you can't quite remember which name you were born with, or worse, which one you're supposed to be using right now. The construction of a believable identity does not begin with a forged passport or a fabricated employment history. It begins with understanding who you need to become at the level of reflex and impulse. The the small behavioral signatures that people use to decide whether someone feels genuine. Intelligence services that specialize in deep cover operations start with personality architecture, mapping out not just what you will claim to be, but how that person would move through the world when no one is watching. Does this version of you drink coffee or tea? And if coffee, do you take it black or with milk? And do you stir it twice or 4 times? And do you leave the spoon in the cup or place it on the saucer? These are not trivial choices. They are the invisible threads that hold a constructed life together. Because people remember patterns more than they remember facts. An inconsistency in the small things triggers suspicion long before anyone consciously realizes something is wrong. The backstory that accompanies a cover identity is designed not for dramatic coherence, but for social plausibility, built around the knowledge that most people reveal their past in fragments rather than narratives. You do not sit down and recite your childhood to a new acquaintance. Instead, it emerges obliquely over months through casual references, opinions, shaped by supposed experience, reactions to places, or events that trigger what appear to be authentic memories. The identity must contain enough texture to survive these incremental revelations, without ever becoming so detailed that you risk contradicting yourself. Under the accumulated weight of improvisation, deliberate imperfections are woven in a vague answer about a period of unemployment, a reluctance to discuss a particular family member, a visible discomfort with certain topics that reads as ordinary human complexity rather than evasion. People trust flawed histories more readily than perfect ones, because perfection itself is memorable, and being memorable is dangerous when your survival depends on being the kind of person others struggle to describe precisely. The psychological dimension of maintaining a cover runs deeper than memorization. Human beings test each other constantly through subtle social mechanisms they are barely aware of deploying, asking the same question in different contexts to see if the answer remains consistent, watching for micro-expressions that betray genuine emotion versus performed responses, noting whether your reactions to unexpected events align with the background you've claimed. Someone who says they grew up in a coastal city should have an automatic relationship with the ocean, not just intellectual knowledge of it, a comfort or discomfort that manifests in body language. When standing near water or hearing gulls or smelling salt air, the way you navigate a supposedly familiar neighborhood, whether you walk with the confidence of someone who knows which streets to avoid at night, whether you instinctively understand local customs, around queuing or greeting strangers, all of this operates below the threshold of conscious deception and must feel true because it is enacted hundreds of times in small and guarded moments. Memory works through association and emotion, not through facts stored in neat files, which means a convincing identity must be lived internally with the same emotional texture that real memories carry, complete with the soft edges and minor contradictions that characterize how people actually remember their own lives. Complexity is the enemy of longevity in cover work. The more elaborate the invented history, the more points of potential failure accumulate over time, each additional detail creating another opportunity for contradiction when you are tired, distracted, or under unexpected emotional pressure. A simple, modest background, a childhood in a medium-sized city, an unremarkable education, work in a profession common enough to be boring, but specialized enough to discourage detailed questions, provides fewer surfaces for scrutiny to gain purchase. The goal is to construct an identity that generates no curiosity, that satisfies the natural human impulse to categorize and understand others without ever inviting deeper investigation. This requires understanding the social environment you are entering with anthropological precision, knowing what questions people ask in that culture, and what answers they find reassuring. What level of openness is expected versus what level of privacy is respected. How much consistency is demanded versus how much vagueness is tolerated. An identity that works in one context can fail catastrophically in another, not because the documents are wrong, but because the behavioral assumptions it rests on do not translate across cultural boundaries. The paradox of long-term cover work is that time both strengthens and erodes the identity simultaneously. Each day lived under the false name builds a genuine history, real relationships formed, real experiences accumulated, a growing web of verifiable interactions that lend credibility. But each day also increases the statistical probability of encountering someone from your actual past, of being asked a question you cannot answer convincingly, of finding yourself in a situation where the identity's limitations become suddenly, catastrophically visible. Emotional stress corrodes the performance in ways that are difficult to predict or control. Grief, fear, unexpected joy, these can cause people to revert to deep patterns of behavior formed in childhood, patterns that may belong to someone else entirely. The longer you live inside the constructed self, the more you accumulate small moments of inconsistency, minor slips that individually mean nothing, but that might form a pattern to someone watching carefully enough. Someone with reason to doubt, someone with access to the right information at the right moment. Once the identity exists not just on paper, but in practice behavior, in rehearsed emotional responses, in the muscle memory of citing a false name without hesitation, the true test begins. The controlled environment where the identity was built gives way to the unpredictable chaos of actual human society, where you cannot script the conversations, cannot anticipate every question, cannot control who you encounter or what they might remember or notice. Every interaction becomes a small gamble, every new relationship a potential point of exposure, every day a continuation of a performance that must never appear to be one. The identity is complete. Now you must live it. And living it means accepting that the margin between success and catastrophic failure is measured, not in grand operational security, but in whether you hesitate for half a second too long when someone asks where you went to school, whether your eyes move in the wrong direction when you claim to remember something you have never actually seen. The identity becomes vulnerable the moment it enters circulation among people who have no reason to question it and every opportunity to notice inconsistencies through sheer repetition. A neighbor who sees you leave for work at the same time each morning will eventually notice if your supposedly fixed schedule becomes erratic without explanation. A colleague who shares lunch with you twice a week will catalog your food preferences, your conversational patterns, the stories you tell when relaxed, and any deviation from the established baseline registers as something slightly off, even if they cannot articulate why. These are not trained observers conducting surveillance, but ordinary people doing what humans do naturally, building mental models of those around them, and noting when reality diverges from expectation. The danger lies not in formal interrogation, but in casual conversation. That circles back to earlier topics and friends who remember what you said 6 months ago and want to hear more, and the slow accumulation of detail that a constructed identity must either supply consistently or deflect without appearing evasive. Memory becomes a battlefield when the false history must be accessed repeatedly, under varying conditions of stress, fatigue, and distraction. You can rehearse a backstory until it flows smoothly in controlled conditions, but retrieving specific details while simultaneously navigating a complex social interaction, reading emotional cues, and maintaining the appropriate personality requires cognitive resources that deplete over time. The mental load of monitoring every word before it leaves your mouth, cross-referencing it against everything you have previously claimed, calculating whether this new piece of information creates vulnerability or reinforcement. This operates constantly in the background of every interaction, attacks on attention that accumulates into exhaustion. When someone asks an unexpected question about your supposed childhood, and you need to generate a plausible answer in real time, you are not just inventing a fact, but ensuring it aligns with the climate of the region you claim to live in, the culture of that era, the economic circumstances that would have shaped your family, all while maintaining natural eye contact and the casual tone of someone recalling rather than fabricating. Emotional reactions betray constructed identities more reliably than factual inconsistencies, because they bypass conscious control. Training can teach you to lie convincingly about events, but the autonomic nervous system responds to stimuli based on actual experience, not claimed history. If you have built an identity around growing up in a stable, loving household, but your real childhood was marked by trauma, the physiological response to certain triggers, a raised voice, a slammed door, particular phrases or situations will not match the person you are pretending to be. People register these mismatches subconsciously. The sense that your reaction does not quite fit your story, that someone who supposedly has the background you claim would respond differently to this specific situation. The longer you maintain relationships under false pretenses, the more opportunities arise for these involuntary revelations, moments where the authentic self flashes through the constructed one, before you can suppress it, leaving observers with a vague unease they might not even consciously acknowledge, but that accumulates into doubt. Social relationships create structural vulnerabilities that intensify over time, rather than dissipate. Surface-level acquaintances require only surface-level consistency, but deeper connections demand emotional availability, spontaneity, and the kind of unguarded moments that are incompatible with constant self-monitoring. A romantic relationship forces you to share intimate details, to react authentically to emotional situations, to allow someone close enough to observe you in uncontrolled states, exhausted or grieving, surprised. When the architecture of the false identity is hardest to maintain, friends expect you to remember shared experiences with the correct emotional valence, to reference inside jokes naturally, to demonstrate that you value the relationship through behavioral consistency over months and years. Each of these connections is both protective cover. Nothing appears more normal than having friends and routines, and a potential point of catastrophic exposure if those people notice accumulating signs that something fundamental about you does not align with the person you claim to be. The psychological toll of sustained cover work manifests not in dramatic breaking points, but in gradual erosion of the boundary between performance and reality. The constant calculation required to navigate even mundane interactions creates a state of perpetual low-level anxiety. The knowledge that any conversation could contain a question you have not prepared for. Any new person could have connections to aspects of your claimed history that you cannot verify. Any moment of authentic reaction could contradict the personality you have constructed. This pressure does not announce itself through panic, but through the slow grinding exhaustion of never being able to fully relax, of maintaining split awareness between the person you are being and the person monitoring that performance for errors, of carrying the weight of knowing that a single significant mistake could render months or years of work meaningless. The mind adapts to this state until the vigilance becomes automatic, which brings its own danger. When constant caution becomes habitual, you lose the ability to recognize when you are under actual scrutiny versus ordinary social interaction, leading either to paranoia that itself attracts attention or to complacency that misses genuine threats. Intelligence services that deploy operatives into long-term cover design the identities with failure modes in mind, structuring them so that if exposure becomes inevitable, it occurs along controlled lines that contain the damage. An identity built around a profession that requires frequent travel provides a natural explanation for sudden disappearance. A background that includes periods of isolation or documented psychological treatment offers plausible cover for behavioral inconsistencies if they are noticed and questioned. The identity is constructed to degrade gracefully rather than collapse catastrophically, with layers of backup explanation that can absorb a certain amount of scrutiny before the core deception becomes visible. This is not optimism, but pragmatic acknowledgement that no cover survives indefinitely under determined investigation, and the goal is to ensure that when it fails in ways that protect broader operational objectives and personnel rather than simply abandoning the operative to consequences. The greatest risk comes not from intelligence agencies or law enforcement conducting systematic checks, but from ordinary people developing the sense that something about you does not quite add up. A colleague who notices that you never mention family in the present tense, only past. A landlord who realizes you have no photographs from the past 5 years. A friend who observes that your emotional reactions to supposedly significant personal history seem oddly muted as if you were describing events that happened to someone else. These observations do not lead to immediate confrontation, but to quiet monitoring, increased attention, casual questions designed to test whether their suspicions have foundation. By the time you realize someone doubts your identity, they have often been watching for weeks or months, cataloging inconsistencies, comparing notes with others who might have noticed similar things, building a case not for authorities but for their own understanding of who you actually are. When exposure arrives, it is rarely through dramatic revelation, but through the slow accumulation of small doubts that finally achieve critical mass. Someone asks a question they have asked before and notices the answer has changed. A background check for routine purpose reveals a discrepancy too significant to dismiss. A chance encounter with someone from your actual past occurs in a context where the false identity cannot be maintained. The moment itself might be quiet, a pause in conversation, a look of confusion, a request to clarify something you said earlier. But it represents the convergence of all the invisible pressures that have been testing the identity since it entered the world. What separates identities that survive from those that collapse is not superior documentation or more elaborate backstories, but something more fundamental about how they were constructed and how they are lived. Something in the alignment between the false self and the environments it must navigate that either holds or fractures under the accumulated weight of human observation and time. The identities that endure are not those built with the most intricate backstories or the most sophisticated documentation, but those constructed with an understanding that human behavior under prolonged observation tends toward entropy rather than consistency. The cover that survives is the one designed with enough flexibility to absorb minor contradictions, enough simplicity to avoid creating unnecessary vulnerability, and enough psychological alignment with the operative as actual capabilities that maintaining it does not require constant exhausting effort. An extroverted person forced to inhabit an introverted identity will eventually fail not through factual error, but through the ululative strain of suppressing natural inclinations. In thousands of small interactions, the most successful covers are those that allow the operative to live as close to their authentic behavioral patterns as possible, while occupying a false frame, minimizing the cognitive distance between who they are and who they must appear to be. This is not about making the lie easier to tell, but about recognizing that sustainable deception requires working with human psychology rather than against it. Intelligence agencies understand that all cover identities have operational lifespans, determined not by calendar time, but by exposure to scrutiny, depth of social integration, and the psychological capacity of the individual maintaining them. An identity intended for a 6-month operation is built differently from one designed to function for years, with different tolerances for complexity and different assumptions about how much investigation it must withstand. The longer an identity must persist, the more it must resemble an actual life rather than a performance, accumulating genuine history, forming real relationships, developing the kind of documented existence that creates its own gravitational pull of credibility. But this same depth of integration creates corresponding difficulty and extraction. The operative cannot simply disappear without leaving questions that might eventually connect back to the agency that deployed them. Exit strategies are embedded in the identity from the beginning, narratives of relocation, or career change, or personal crisis that provide plausible explanations for sudden departure, allowing the identity to be retired without triggering the kind of investigation that exposure would demand. The human cost of extended cover work is measured not in dramatic psychological breaks, but in the quiet erosion of the authentic self through prolonged disuse. When you spend years responding to a name that is not yours, celebrating a birthday that is not your actual birth date, maintaining relationships built on foundations of deliberate deception, the person you were before entering cover becomes increasingly abstract, a collection of facts you know about yourself rather than a lived identity. Operatives returning from deep cover often describe a sense of dislocation, of no longer being entirely certain which version of themselves is real. of having to consciously reconstruct preferences and habits that should be automatic. The brain adapts to the demands placed on it, and when those demands require sustained inhabitation of a false self, the neural pathways associated with the authentic self weaken through lack of use. This is not metaphorical, but neurological identity is not a fixed essence, but a pattern of activation reinforced through repetition. And when you stop reinforcing one pattern in favor of another, the original begins to fade. The emotional distance required to maintain effective cover creates a particular kind of isolation that cannot be fully communicated to those who have not experienced it. You are surrounded by people who believe they know you, who trust you, who consider you a friend or colleague or partner, and you understand at a fundamental level that everything they believe about you is deliberately constructed, that the relationship they value is built on a foundation you could dismantle by walking away without explanation the moment operational necessity demands it. This awareness prevents genuine intimacy even when you develop authentic affection for people in your cover life, because intimacy requires vulnerability, and you cannot be vulnerable without exposing the deception. The loneliness is not about physical isolation, but about epistemic solitude. You are the only person who knows the truth about yourself, and that truth is itself a form of isolation, a wall between you and every human connection you form. The most effective covers do not end in dramatic exposure or hurried escape, but simply cease to exist when they are no longer needed. The identity retired through gradual withdrawal that attracts no special attention. The documents are allowed to lapse, the apartment lease ends, the job terminates, and the person who inhabited that name fades from the social landscape the way people naturally do when they move cities or change careers or drift out of contact. The relationships dissolve through benign neglect, the kind of slow distancing that characterizes most human connections when geographic or circumstantial proximity ends. Those who knew the false identity are left with memories of someone who was real to them, but who never actually existed. Their recollections accurate about the person they encountered, but fundamentally mistaken about who that person was. The cover's success is measured by how little trace it leaves, how few questions its disappearance generates, how thoroughly it can be unmade without revealing that it was made in the first place. What intelligence agencies understand that most people do not is that human trust operates largely on assumption rather than verification. We accept the identities people present to us because the cognitive cost of constant verification would make normal social interaction impossible, and because most people have no reason to lie about fundamental facts of their existence. The entire architecture of society depends on this trust, on the assumption that when someone tells you their name, shows you identification, claims a background or profession, they are representing themselves truthfully. Cover identities exploit this vulnerability not through elaborate deception, but through the simple presentation of consistency over time, understanding that if you behave as though you are who you claim to be, if the documents support the claim, if your behavior aligns with the background, most people will never think to question it. The sophistication lies not in the complexity of the lie, but in the recognition that human beings are not naturally suspicious of those who appear unremarkable, who generate no cognitive dissonance, who fit comfortably into expected categories. The real strength of an intelligence service that excels at cover work is not technological or procedural, but psychological, a deep understanding of how identity is performed and perceived, how memory functions in social contexts, how trust accumulates and erodes, how people signal authenticity through behavioral patterns they are not consciously aware of maintaining. This knowledge allows the construction of identities that pass not because they are perfect, but because they align with the expectations and perceptual limitations of those who encounter them, because they account for how humans actually process information about other humans rather than how we imagine we do. The recognition that verification is rare, that most social interaction operates on good faith, that inconsistencies must be quite significant before they register as suspicious. This is what makes sustained cover possible in a world where identifying someone should theoretically be straightforward, but practically requires levels of attention and skepticism that few people maintain in ordinary life. Every day you encounter people whose identities you accept without verification, whose backgrounds you believe without evidence, whose lives you take on faith because they present themselves with sufficient consistency and normality to trigger no doubt. The question is not whether some of those identities might be constructed rather than authentic, but how you would know the difference if the construction were done with sufficient care, sufficient understanding of human psychology, sufficient patience. The uncomfortable truth is that you probably would not, and that most of the mechanisms you imagine would protect you from deception, your intuition, your ability to read people, your assumption that you would notice something wrong are far more fragile than you believe. Trust is not a weakness, but it is a vulnerability, and the world contains people trained to understand exactly how the vulnerability functions and how it can be exploited with a precision that leaves no visible trace.